have quite a lot of discussion, I hope. But the first speaker is Chris Millward. So Chris, we're very grateful to Chris in that he wrote a Civic Insights piece for us recently on the Civic University Network, which if you haven't read, I do encourage you to download. And that was really the impetus of this event today, just thinking about the interaction between prosperity and pathways and progression routes, and what we as universities can do in this space to really sort of harness and help on the prosperity, to help to sort of address the prosperity puzzle. So Chris, I'm sure, is known to many of you. He's our first speaker. He's the first one off the blocks today, Director of Fair Access and Participation of the Office of Students, and previously of HEFSCE. So over to Chris, I think, for the first remarks.
Okay, thanks Natalie and colleagues at the Civic University Commission for arranging today, and thank you to all of you for joining, and also for all the work you've been doing over the last 12 months or so, and right now supporting students and staff in your institutions, all of this whilst I'm sure your own work and your own personal lives are disrupted. There's a lot already to learn from this. So firstly, it seems to me that higher education has become more important than ever. There's more scrutiny on universities and colleges, but also greater recognition of your work. I think that's true for the direct contribution that's been made to tackling the pandemic, charting the spread of the virus, leading the race for a vaccine, and now understanding its effectiveness, enabling health and other trainees to join the front line, and of course sharing facilities. Also, the degree of attention to the shift to blended and online learning this year and university admissions. I think we saw last summer how central higher education is now to the ambitions and the expectations of families throughout the country. More students want to reach higher education. We can see that this year in the admissions data overall, in the lowest participation groups and in crucial areas like nursing. And I think we'll see that happen again next year. And this is, of course, not just an English phenomenon. We're seeing this all around the world. So it's more important than ever that we ensure that the differences in resources we've seen between families and schools, particularly during the pandemic, doesn't prescribe who ultimately gets into higher education. Alongside this, I think we've seen a greater focus on place than ever, and that's due on the one hand to the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on different parts of the country, particularly the most disadvantaged people and communities, because it's affected by living conditions, underlying health and working patterns. It's also because of the extent to which the resilience effort has been local, and schools, universities and colleges playing a really important part of that. There's also the issue of what is the long-term effect on jobs and on different parts of the country, and it has been predicted that the toughest impact will be in coastal and ex-industrial parts of the country, which is also where we've identified the lowest levels of HE participation. So I guess the question for today, from my point of view, is how can we maximise the contribution universities and colleges can make during the coming months and years, not just to recovering from coronavirus, but also the prosperity of local areas. And for OFS, that's a question about how our statutory duties, which are relating to issues like choice and equality of opportunity, can be directed and aligned in a way that supports local prosperity. And I'll just finish by talking about 3 examples of that. So firstly, through the access and participation plans that are agreed with OFS, universities and colleges have committed to enrol significantly more students from those parts of the countries that are underrepresented, those coastal and ex-industrial parts of the country that we see the greatest underrepresentation, and also tackling inequalities beyond enrolment where we see that. We will be discussing with universities and colleges this year, and the outreach partnerships we fund in local areas, whether any priorities need to change. And that could be, for example, more students staying local in the current environment. There could be more demand from adults to upskill and to retrain. And indeed, there could be a stronger emphasis on collaboration and progression between further and higher education, and indeed routes through apprenticeships. We want this to be what we call a something for something discussion. So we can't let the level of ambition change, but we are interested in how plans might need to align to reflect the environment we'll be in later this year. Secondly, we know that educational interventions on their own will not equalise opportunities and indeed generate prosperity on their own. They need to be joined up with interventions in other areas like jobs, health, transport and housing. So we have been exploring how to increase the contribution students and graduates make to their local communities, to businesses and public services, including, for example, by positioning students more centrally within universities' knowledge exchange strategies and thinking about how we can improve the take-up of graduate skills in local areas. And that's particularly important for smaller employers and indeed for students who study and work locally, which is often a higher proportion than you would think. Work placement during and soon after study is often a central part of this, but we need to build on that during the coming year. Then lastly, one of the characteristics of the Act that set up the OFS and UK research and innovation is the importance of sharing and collaboration between the two organisations, so that the priorities we have for regulating and funding on behalf of students can be joined up with the approach to research and development. So you may be aware that the government has said that it wants research and development funding to take greater account of place in the future, ensuring it supports the levelling up agenda. And it's also identified the link between the funding we provide as OFS for learning and teaching in higher education and the research base beyond that. A really important part of that, of course, is ensuring that all students with the ability and the interest have the opportunity to progress into postgraduate research and research careers. But I think, as we're also seeing through the vaccine rollout, for example, the jobs that can be generated from R&D investment will extend well beyond researchers themselves. They'll require management, technical, commercial and legal skills. In fact, the full range of skills you need in a modern organisation. So if local people are really to benefit from increased research and development investment, they'll need the knowledge, the skills, the connections to access and compete for those jobs. And that's where I think universities in particular have a crucial role to play, because they can connect together schools, further education, higher education and research. So I'm interested in your views on how we can make that happen. That's it from me. Thanks, Natalie. I will hand back to you.
Thanks, Chris. That's great. This sets up the conversation, I think, extremely well. Just had a quick question, I guess, in terms of the recent admissions round that we've just been through, where I think some of us were surprised we didn't see as many sort of an increase in kind of local applicants for their local universities as perhaps we expected, the sort of corona effect. And I wondered if that was something that you'd anticipated in the OFS, and whether that sort of changes things in terms of how you think about UniConnect and other programs.
So I think we thought early in the admission cycle that there could be more local demand. And actually, I've only seen regional level data on this. So it is still quite possible that at sub-regional levels in towns and cities, you are seeing an effect of that kind. When I talk to people in further education, they've highlighted high levels of students progressing through, and a lot of that will be local. So there's an issue for me about how we enable progression through that route as well. And I think probably you will see increased demand locally over time.
That's great. Thank you. Well, we'll come on to a bit on FE and so on through the course of the afternoon, I should say. It's been a long day already. Okay, let's move on to our next speaker. So next we're going to call on Karen Statten, the Vice Chancellor of Solent University. So Karen was previously Vice Chancellor at York St John's, and she's worked at a number of other universities across Scotland and King's College London, and also previously at Sheffield Hallam. So it's lovely to talk to Karen again, and let's hear from Karen now.
Thank you, Natalie, and I'm really delighted to be part of this important event today, and also just to mention the great work that the Civic University Network is doing as well. Thank you. So talent is everywhere and opportunity is not. And as we are already aware, the pandemic is only going to, I think, sharpen that particular issue. So I've been asked to talk this afternoon about what Solent University is doing, and I'm very much going to focus on why I believe that the university has to be taking a major role in tackling this agenda. So I'm going to start with a little bit of context setting, if I may, around place, because I think it's really important to this discussion. So the university is in the heart of Southampton. Our name, Solent, reflects the region, which is bordered in the east by Portsmouth, in the west by the New Forest, and it includes the Isle of Wight as well. The region has a very proud maritime history. It's got a very significant visitor and tourist economy. And Southampton itself is the busiest cruise terminal in the UK and the second largest container port. It is essentially an international gateway and an economic hub for the UK. It's got a very diverse population. 60 languages are spoken in a population of around 250,000. The Solent is a social mobility index cold spot, and it has some of the lowest progression rates from FE into HE in the country. Over 70% of the university's students are first in the family, and our access and participation plan has a range of really challenging targets within it. As a result of COVID, across the Solent region, 31% of residents have been furloughed, 45,000 people have claimed unemployment benefit, and 27,000 jobs have already been lost, which represents 23% of the jobs within the population. So the short-term negative impact on the region is circa 11 billion. So this is quite a difficult space for the city and the region to be in. And the university has decided that as part of its new strategic plan, we need to roll up our sleeves and really be at the centre of this. And so I'm going to talk about 3 things that the university is currently doing. Firstly, we are looking to create a skills ladder for the city. The city has traditionally had a poor FE base. Over 70% of the students in Southampton actually travel outside of Southampton to seek Ofsted rated good provision. Both the FEC, the Further Education Commission, and the Education Skills Funding Council have recognised that this is a major issue for the city and for the region, and has put together a small group. Essentially, about 8 months ago, I was approached by the FEC and the ESFA and essentially asked to demonstrate civic leadership. So to create a group that is actually going to look at mapping level 1 all the way through to level 7 at postgraduate level study, and essentially create a number of centres, and they will be subject specific in nature. So this is a really exciting and a really significant development for the city, and the university is at the heart of that. In addition, as a kind of smaller example of that, the university is also leading on an Institute of Technology bid, which is focused on maritime. And again, the intention of that bid is to really bring together the whole range of qualifications all the way through the spectrum and jointly delivered by the university and by the FE sector. The second thing I want to mention is that through a public, civic and business partnership within Southampton, through a venue called Southampton Connect, we are tackling the levelling up agenda by focusing on social mobility, skills and the need for local businesses. So the partnership includes the Chamber of Commerce, and we are looking to help shape the local skills development plan that has recently been announced by the government. The third thing I would say is that the university's new strategy is really looking to tackle both the challenges and the opportunities that the fourth industrial revolution, and in particular AI, will bring. So our strategy focuses on graduating students who are work ready, world ready and future ready. And we're really proud that as part of that, we've got one of the game-changing projects, which is looking at AI and data science postgraduate conversion courses. And those courses are actually nationally showing greater diversity, including attracting admissions from more BAME, more female and disabled students as well. And in addition, we're packaging that with a range of hardship funds to particularly focus on digital bursary and digital poverty as well. So I think there's three things that I would draw from that in terms of what we have learned, particularly over the last 8 months during the pandemic and in the city and in the region. Firstly, I think a system-wide leadership approach is really critical. Secondly, that we must be demand-led and ensure that we are providing what is needed rather than what we think is needed. And so in order to promote participation and prosperity, we must be led by the region, by the colleges, by the businesses in terms of what their demands and requirements are. And thirdly, we must measure the impact of all of this. And I believe, as Chris has highlighted earlier, that actually the KEF, the Knowledge Exchange Framework, is going to be potentially an excellent tool to help us do that. So to summarise, I really believe in civic and system-wide leadership on this. Jointly facing into the issues is critical, and being able to evidence-base the impact of our work. Thank you. Thank you, Natalie.
Thanks, Karen. That was a really fantastic set of examples and some lessons. And of course, we at the Civic University Network are always pleased to hear of the real civic mission driving university strategies. I guess, one question that has popped up in the chat and I was going to also reflect on was about, how expanding on what you mean by system-wide leadership. And I was also struck by, by the skills ladder example and this sort of example of the university and FE colleges working from level 1 to level 7. I guess interested to learn a little bit more about that, and also if you can perhaps tell us what's changed. So how is it? How have you overcome, I guess, some of the barriers perhaps between the different institutions working together on these sorts of initiatives in the past?
Sure. So system-wide, my definition of that is absolutely that it's all agencies. Essentially it is the civic, it is the business, it is the college, it is the university sector doing this. And I think that is fundamental to addressing this issue around local prosperity. We need buy-in from all of those agencies. An individual university cannot achieve this on its own. I think the skills ladder is really exciting. Personally, and I'm delighted to be part of this. It's very early days in terms of that mapping, but we've done it through Zoom collaboration, really, to try and get all the stakeholders involved. But as I say, part of the reason that this is a focus is that we have actually been asked to do this as well by the FEC, by the ESFA. So there is buy-in, and this is actually something that's also on the minister's table as well, I'd have to say. And your last question, I think, was around sort of more barriers, wasn't it, Natalie? And well, it's early days, and trying to get a consensus where individual colleges or indeed the university might have to make changes in terms of their own portfolio, for example, to ensure that you've got a citywide scheme. Obviously is something that we're working our way through at the moment, because it means some institutions may need to give up provision in a particular area in order to ensure that we've got that citywide approach to it.
Thank you, that's great. I think we'll come back to some of those themes throughout the afternoon, I think, but it's fantastic start. We might just move on to our next speaker, and as I said, we'll have a lot more discussion towards the end. So our next speaker is Dr. Omar Khan. He's director of TASO, which is Transforming Access and Student Outcomes in Higher Education. His CV is up there on the screen for us all. We're also pleased that Omar's joined us because he is also a member of the Civic University Network Advisory Group. So has been a really helpful voice in that group in helping us to shape our direction. And I think, Omar, you've got some slides that you're going to share with us. So over to you, Omar, if you want to share your slides.
Yes, and I'm going to have to lean in a bit because my microphone wasn't working. So apologies if my forehead is quite large on your screen. And give me a moment. Hopefully the technology of screen sharing works quickly and effectively.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So I've called this leveling up, tackling regional and other inequalities in higher education. I suppose if I were going to give my presentation a two-word summary, it would be both and. And I'll try to explain that in the summary slide, the final slide. I thought some of you may be unfamiliar with what TASO is, so I know I don't have a lot of time, but I thought it'd be worth explaining who we are, because we're here also to support the sector to deliver on their ambitions in tackling the wide range of inequalities that we see in higher education. So we are the Center for Transforming Access and Student Outcomes in Higher Education. I know that's a bit of a mouthful. We call ourselves TASO as for short. We're an independent hub for higher education professionals to access research toolkits to help tackle participation and other equality gaps within the sector. We're set up by a consortium, you can see there, of King's College, Nottingham Trent University, and the Behavioral Insights team. We are an affiliate What Works Center, so this is a UK government movement to try to improve the quality of policy making, in particular the evidence on what causally makes a policy work or not. And in our case, obviously, we're interested in inequalities in higher education. And we are funded by the Office for Students until 2022. And thank you to Chris for your support. And I thought I'd just also very quickly just highlight the range of equality gaps, both that TASO is trying to tackle, but all of you, of course, on this call, either as speakers or presenters or attendants, are concerned about. And I thought I'd also explain how these link to the issue of regional inequalities, especially regional labor market inequalities. I think we're all familiar with the fact that there are inequalities in terms of career outcomes in higher education. And so that's the sort of final step, and the link there between those inequalities in the labor market and regional economic performance, I think, are quite explicit. But I think I'd also just like to highlight the fact that obviously questions of admissions and retention have a direct role to play on local economic inequalities. You know, the effect and the inequalities that we see in terms of who does and who doesn't enter which universities will obviously, and who does and who doesn't get a first or a 2-1 will obviously affect labor market inequalities locally. Because we're focused more on higher education specifically, I will come on to how this affects, in my view, the leveling up agenda, but I think it's worth first indicating just how extensive and the pattern of inequalities by region or local area in Britain. There are very large gaps between different regions in terms of HE participation rates. Although, having said that there are large regional gaps at the sort of regional level, so looking at, say, the Southeast or the Northeast or Yorkshire or the Southwest, Wales or Scotland, London is far ahead of all regions. So the regional inequalities are there, but London really has a strikingly higher HE participation rate. So it's within region gaps where we really see the striking differences, for example, at local authority area, and in particular things like comparing free school meal and non-free school meal students. And those gaps between free school meal and non-free school meal students vary hugely by local authority. So in places like Wokingham and Reading, there's a gap of 35% percentage points between the participation rates of the most well-off and the least well-off students, or between free school meal and non-free school meal students. And Bracknell Forest in Hampshire have the lowest free school meal participation rates. I'll come back to that, but I just wanted to flag that those are in the southeast of England, which is usually perceived to have a strong economic performance. And it sort of indicates the fact that while it's true that we have regional inequalities of economic performance, when we look within region, even areas that look to be doing strong economically, like Berkshire, which is where all of those 4 local authorities are situated, we see very significant inequalities that remain in higher education. And even more strikingly than local authority areas are constituency or super output area inequality. So looking at neighborhood level inequalities of higher education participation rates. And again, I'm looking specifically here at participation rates. I think Chris has written a blog for the OFS on this, but there are certain constituencies in Britain where every single postcode in those constituencies or in those areas are in the lowest participation rates, for example, Nottingham North and Great Yarmouth. And those, we typically now are familiar with analysis that those are sort of ex-industrial towns or cities or coastal areas, and a lot of them, of course, being what we now describe as blue or red wall or ex-red wall seats. I did want to just give you one chart on the sort of showing the difference of free school meal participation rates by region, and just pick out 2 points here. One is that not only does London have very much higher participation rates than the rest of the country, but it also has a much narrower gap between free school meal and non-free school meal students. So whereas in most of the country, the free school meal, non-free school meal participation rate is 20 points, or even twice as many students non-free school meals as on free school meals attend. In London, it's only 10 percentage points. And it's such that the higher participation, the participation rate for inner London pupils on free school meals is higher than the higher education participation rate for non-free school meals on children on not on free school meals in every other region. And one of the other reasons I was highlighting those data on sort of Reading and Wokingham is it also suggests that the London effect doesn't spread very far, right? Because those are kind of commuter areas just outside of London. So there's something specific going on in London, and some of that is probably down to the demographics and the characteristics of the students living there. So what is then the link between those higher education equality gaps that we see, and then the sort of economic performance or local area inequalities and economic performance? There is a correlation between low higher education participation areas. So areas that have lower participation rates at university tend to have lower levels of income and lower economic performance. But it's not a perfect correlation. I've already used the example of the Southeast, but even within other areas, we see places that have stronger economic performance, sometimes having lower HE participation rates and vice versa. I think there's also an interesting question, and again, I think the previous speakers have already touched on that, on what is the policy intervention that we should be advocating for. Is it to tackle those regional economic inequalities or local economic performance directly? Or is it to focus on boosting skills and qualifications regionally or locally? And then, of course, there's other major questions and major debates that I'm not going to comment on, but what is the right unit or area of intervention if we're interested in economic policy? Is it the region? Is it the city? Or is it the town? And, you know, will investing in a town be the best way forward, or is investing in a city going to have effects for the local area around it, including the towns? So this is my last slide. What does this mean for leveling up? So I have said that lower higher education participation rates correlate somewhat with lower economic performance. So I would suggest that this means that we need to both invest in local economies and tackle those lower HE participation rates. But I think we need to be cautious about overstating the fact that the extent to which one will follow the other, right? So an increased number of people with qualifications in an area, i.e. boosting the number of people who go to university, won't necessarily lead to better labor market outcomes if the local economic opportunities remain weak. And so we have to be cautious and careful about overstating the link. I think there is a link, it's clear, but we also need both policies to improve HE participation rates and independently policies that improve economic performance and opportunities locally, better jobs. There are existing links, and I think other speakers may talk about this, between local areas and HE providers, especially in terms of things like sandwich degrees and placements. And I think it's one of the things that Tezo is interested in our next themes as we explore. What is the causal evidence on what kinds of interventions there have the most effect, not just in terms of improving the graduate employment rates generally for a university or college, but for tackling the equality gaps between different kinds of graduates. But I think it is really important to remember that tackling regional inequalities won't necessarily address other forms of inequality, right? So we can imagine a policy that really boosted middle-class jobs in a particular region, but didn't, and so narrowed the gap between, say, London and other regions, but didn't really address the long-standing inequalities in terms of class, race, socioeconomic disadvantage, disability, care leavers, and mature learners. So as I said, my kind of conclusion is what I started with, is I think we need both and we need both and in three ways. We need both interventions that tackle the existing inequalities in higher education and policies to tackle economic underperformance. We need both policies that tackle regional inequalities in HE, but also other forms of inequalities, such as preschool meals, disability, race, and class. And finally, we both need to advocate for policies because they correlate with each other, so that we know that improving economic performance will lead to more local people wanting to go to university and vice versa. But also, we should advocate for the goal of increasing higher education participation rates independently of its effect on local economic performance. So that's, as I said, my summary is lots of both ands there, and I hope I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Omar. That was excellent. I think if we stop sharing screen, that all worked and we got to hear you. So that was great. I mean, just a quick question for Omar before we move on to the other speakers. Really interesting analysis around sort of the unit of analysis, etc. But I wonder what you might reflect in terms of specifically through a COVID lens, because it would seem that many of the problems you're outlining there are going to be vastly exacerbated by COVID and the unequal impact of COVID. And I just wondered if you had any initial thoughts, particularly on the sort of graduates of, say, 2020, 2021, so last year and this year. They'll have had less sort of opportunity for placements, less opportunity for sort of, I call it economic networking, with potential employers, etc. And what sorts of things, you think, what universities could be doing for these cohorts of students so that the sort of outcomes and advantages, won't be sort of, quite disproportionately different for these graduates than sort of ones that have gone past and the ones that will come after COVID has hopefully left our midst.
You like a big question there. I'm not sure.
Just a small question for you.
Yeah, I don't know have a great answer. I mean, I would say that yes, I think it is very worrying. I want to very much extend my sympathy and concern for recent graduates. I think the labor market was tough going into COVID for graduates, and I think that it's going to get, unfortunately, a bit tougher. I think it does speak to the need for employers to be better much linked with universities. So from both ends, I think universities and colleges may need to do even further and more outreach with local employers. But I think those inequalities are particularly worrying, I would say. The fact that we already have such large inequalities, if there's fewer graduate jobs and there's more competition, whenever you have more competition for fewer jobs, those with the sort of strongest CVs or those with the most traditional CVs are likely to be most advantaged. So I think to the extent that there are fewer graduate jobs in the next year, I think we need to be making the case not just with HE providers, but with employers. We need to be saying to them, like, take a look at all of the young people. Don't just use, because they're going to have such an excessive number of people applying for fewer jobs. We can't have them making sort of shortcut decisions, and we need to make sure that they're taking a look at all of our young people. Yeah, I'll leave it there because I'm sure there's plenty of good ideas in the audience as well on this.
Great. Well, we'll certainly come back to these sorts of COVID themes, I think. We might just continue on with our speakers, but thank you very much, Omar. So our next speaker, it's always a pleasure at these events, not just to have one Vice Chancellor, but to have two. I feel like, we're extremely lucky today. So now we're going to Keele University with the Vice Chancellor, Professor Trevor McMillan. Trevor was previously at Lancaster University and obviously has a wealth of experience in terms of academic developments and partnerships with other universities and external environments and external organisations. So very interested to hear from the perspectives of Keele as our next speaker. Thank you, Trevor.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Natalie. Yes, I'm unmuted, so that should be fine. It's great to be here and so many interesting issues raised already. I almost feel like abandoning what I was going to say and start to pick up some of those issues, but that'd probably be a bit of a dangerous thing to do. So let's just briefly cover off some of the issues I thought I would cover. And fundamentally, I think two things. One, really just to remind us that there is a job to be done, and we've already heard some of that, but also that actually there are ways to do it, and there are things that we know we can do to move things on. In terms of the job to be done, this might seem an obvious thing in an audience like this, but you certainly won't be surprised to hear me say that going to university is a good thing. And I say, it is obvious for most of us, because I'm sure we all do believe that the knowledge, the skills and the attributes that are developed and indeed the experiences that are gained are life-changing for the individuals that come to university and create the sort of citizen and the sort of society that we all want to live in. But we do have to keep making that case, I think, and it's going to be important that we keep on doing that. Having said that, of course, university isn't for everyone, and we absolutely must exist in an ecosystem that does provide those opportunities for a whole range of types of education and training, and indeed the levels of training that individuals and society needs. And we've already heard from Karen, for example, how all of that can work together. But fundamentally, the way I tend to think about it is that we absolutely have to have a situation where for as many young people as possible, and I think one of the consequences of COVID is that actually increasingly it's not just the young people that we have to worry about, it is the returners, the more what we would consider to be mature students that are going to be an increasing population that we need to work with even more. But for as many of those people as possible, the decision to go to university or not has to be a genuine active choice. It is something that is on the table for them, and that it's not a foregone conclusion for them that university is just not for them. Or indeed, we should probably as a society be looking the other way, that occupations that don't necessarily require a higher education are open and valuable and valued as areas for those who could go to university and have that choice, but actually need not go. Now, again, you might not hear many vice chancellors say that, but that is the truism around the variation that we have. Chris is, as always, very eloquent about setting out the problem, so I won't say any more about that, other than just to remind people very, very briefly that Keele does exist in North Staffordshire, 3 or 4 miles from Stoke, very much one of those post-industrial areas where some of the local issues are very significant and participation rates are low. So how do we effectively create that choice for individuals and allowing that choice to be made in as an informed way as possible? And I'm just going to cover off a couple of areas for now, but then be fascinated to get into the discussion around more the sense of place. And you won't be surprised, those of you who know me have already spotted the question around the knowledge exchange framework and the Concordat in the chat line. But I just want to talk a little bit about our UniCorrect Higher Horizons project that's run from Keele. And I know, well, I suspect many on the call are very familiar with this and probably even more familiar than I am with the general scheme. And of course, we're all very, very grateful to Chris and his colleagues for funding this. And it is good news that it looks like there will be more funding available over the next few years. But we run one from Keele that involves Staffordshire, Chester and Harper Adams universities. It covers 3 counties and has about 130 target schools. And those areas are where progression to HE is low. And I won't go into the details, but it's where the progression is low, but actually the GCSE attainment levels suggest that there is the potential there to move on, but that potential has not yet been realized. All sorts of activities, the outreach activities, residentials, campus visits, mentoring, after school, Saturday clubs, working with both young people and their families, which again, I think is an important dimension. Some quick numbers, nearly 2,500 activities delivered since 2017, over 21,000 young people engaged, 74% of them are from polar quintiles 1 and 2, 68% of the participants had no family history of HE. Importantly, we've managed to keep going with virtual engagement over the last year and again entailing some interactions with both parents and carers. And we've seen over 13,000 virtual engagements with young people over that period. In terms of the impact of that, clearly it's continuous evaluation, as we've just heard. Really important that we keep on top of all of that. But within the cohort we have between 2017 and 19, those that were engaged with the project and were old enough to enter higher education in 2019, 46.5% of them accepted an offer to study at university. And that compares with the average progression rate for that cohort of about 18%. The participants on Higher Horizons are 2.5 times more likely to accept an offer than those in the same cohort who have not engaged with the project. And specifically as a university, this has helped us between, actually overall, if we look between 2014 and 2019, the proportion of our students from the lowest participation neighborhoods has risen from 14% to 20% at enrollment. So obviously that's some high level numbers that actually I think should give us all encouragement that we can do something about that. What is it that underpins all of that success? Well, I think again, that's got to be under continuous evaluation. We suspect that partly it's around impartial advice, partly because it's about a collaboration between universities. It's clearly free for schools. That's critical, particularly at the moment. The locally led nature of these projects we think is important because of exactly recognizing the nature of our local communities and what else is available, and talking the right language and not just with the right accents, I think is important. But also for the schools themselves to have that level of consistency and regularity and predictability of the interactions rather than it just being sporadic is critical. And I think that's why it's even more important that the funding for this area has been fantastic up till now, and the hope of that future funding is critical. So in terms of getting students here, I think there are clearly ways that we can improve on that. But as with many aspects, obviously at university, we have to make sure that they succeed when we get here. And I just want to briefly touch on one aspect of that, and that is the fact that here at Keele, like many other universities, we run a very, very successful foundation year. The last few years, between 400 and 500 students coming into the foundation year. Over a third of our intake is from Pola 1 and 2, and a bit of variation between years, but between 70 and 80% of that group progress into year 1, where overall they perform just as well as those from the higher Pola quintiles who have followed the same route. These are not just about Keele, it's also covered off in, or demonstrated in other English universities and right across the board for foundation years, for example, in 18 and 19, a whole range of really important parameters. 47% were from BAME background, and 15% were from the really most disadvantaged areas in England. Importantly, again, at national level, 86% of foundation year students from the most disadvantaged areas progressed to degree study, and that compares with 57% who took other routes into universities. But the diversity is also important, not just from the BAME population, but also I think, we're seeing from at national level around mature students. So 49% of mature students who were admitted to university based on work experience alone and not necessarily their academic qualifications per se, did come through a foundation year. So an important route. And if we put all of those disadvantages, the roots around the COVID, or the problems around the COVID all together, then I just wanted to highlight the fact that actually that is an important part of what we do for you in universities to really facilitate that transition from either FE or schools into the university, and really putting the students on a good footing to make sure that they succeed, not just within the university environment, but in their career choices afterwards. And I'll stop there, Natalie. Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor. That was a fantastic set of comments to sort of help kick us off, and a really impressive story around UniConnect and the initiatives at your university in terms of connecting with colleges and schools, particularly in the current environment, which is hugely impressive. I certainly know from our own university that the program is incredibly powerful in terms of connecting with sort of disadvantaged students, and would echo the point also about foundation years. And obviously, in the avalanche of policy documents that came out just a couple of weeks back in the snappily titled interim conclusion to the Augur report, we obviously saw in there evidence that the government's going to do a consultation around foundation years. And that's certainly something that we at the network and at Sheffield Hallam see as a really critical aspect of our offer in terms of reaching disadvantaged students and students from poorer backgrounds and BAME communities. So, my main point there is just to really echo the sort of great work you're doing there at Keele and say well done. We'll look forward to hearing a bit more. But we might just move on to our last speaker before I open it up for questions. I know there have been some questions in the chat already about PEF and various things which I haven't missed. I will come back to them. If you do have a question, do pop it into the chat, and we'll soon be opening it up to all the panelists. But our last but in no means least speaker is Sammy Wright. Really pleased to have Sammy with us. He joins us from Sunderland, where he's Vice Principal of Southmore Academy, and he's also the lead for schools and HE on the Social Mobility Commission. So really interested to get a sense from Sammy about what all this means in terms of his own perspectives on the Commission and also in terms of schools within Sunderland. So Sammy, over to you as our last speaker, and then we'll open up to questions.
I was the one who did the mute.
Oh, right.
Someone was going to. I do apologise. No, first thing is an apology because my headshot was created at the end of the last lockdown, and I would love to demonstrate that I'm normally a little bit more kempt, but unfortunately we're in another lockdown, so I yet again haven't visited a barber for a while. Now, what I would like to just do is, there's been such a lot that's been said by the other speakers, which I absolutely would agree with. I think some fantastic examples of really good work that people have done in order to widen participation and to engage with local environments. I'd like to point towards two bits of research that the Social Mobility Commission have done recently, which I think are very illuminating in light of a lot of the comments about place. And that is the long shadow of deprivation and moving out to move up. And just to kind of suggest that people might want to see some of the conclusions from these at a later date, because moving out to move up found very strong correlation between social mobility and literal mobility. So you have people moving from their hometown into other areas across the country. And obviously a lot of that is to do with moving to other places for university study. The long shadow of deprivation, I think, sits alongside that. And that piece of research was out in October. And what we found there was that the areas which you might term social mobility cold spots, and that we've indicated before on the Social Mobility Index, when we looked at them in detail in terms of later destinations, so we looked at students who'd been classified as disadvantaged at 16 and re-examined them at the age of 28 to see where they'd gone on to in terms of their further destinations. What we saw was a huge range of impacts, whereby some areas, the difference in the disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged destinations was due to education, and solely education. So if you were disadvantaged but happened to do well at school, you would then get as good a destination as someone who was non-disadvantaged and got the same grades. Whereas in other areas, that link was broken. And you'd have as much of a third of the impact on people in their destinations at the age of 28 coming not from their educational achievement, but from the other factors in the local area. And I think that's something very, very powerful to keep in mind. And several people have talked about the difference geographically between the environments and the way universities interact with the local environment. And what I would suggest is that we need to be very careful about suggesting the same solutions are applicable in very different contexts. Now, what I'd like to go on to do, I want to go do a very quick run through what I would say are three key problems for social mobility in connection to HE. And they've been touched on by other people, so I'm not going to go into huge detail, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of the major points as I see them. So the three things that I would like to dwell on are the uptake of HE places, the outreach from universities, and the destinations that graduates then go on to achieve. Now, if we start with the uptake, as we've seen, Omar gives some fantastic insights into the picture for free school meal students and different levels of disadvantage across the country. But what I would like to highlight is that our measures of disadvantage are very, very blunt. Okay, so Polar, for example, has huge issues with it. One of the things that we see is, in London, as I'm sure people are well aware, there are very few Polar 1 and 2 quintiles because of the nature of the population and the way that it's, the housing stock and the physical environment actually doesn't divide people in the same way. Equally, when we go to things like free school meals, if you compare the length of time that students are on free school meals, in Surrey, the average length of time is 6 months. In Middlesbrough, the average length of time is 3.5 years. And there is a wealth of research from people such as Stephen Gorard, from recent reports from the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, all of which show an absolute solid correlation, not just between free school meals and educational underachievement, but between length of time on free school meals and educational underachievement. And I think that's something we've really got to keep in mind, is when we talk about access and fair access, we cannot be deceived by broad categories. And we have to try and drill down beneath them to see the people who are the very most disadvantaged and who are stuck in these situations where there really isn't much shift over the last few years. That takes me on to outreach, because there's some brilliant projects that are going on. I've loved hearing about the project at Keele there. So many things where universities are really getting into communities. But I do have to be blunt and to say that alongside that, there is also a lot of outreach from universities, which is really not tackling the deeper issues. So I would encourage any universities to think about the deeper systemic engagement with schools and just really have a huge amount of caution around the idea that one can turn up and say university is a great destination and say it's going to do all these things for us without actually trying to engage with young people and demonstrate that it does that. And I'd cite perhaps the EPI report from January last year, which found that actually a lot of widening participation projects seem to measure on engagement and aspiration rather than actually on the final destination of enrollment. So please do keep that in mind. The last thing of those 3 points is destinations. And this is where we need to again have, on the one hand, a recognition of some of the brilliant work that's done in the sector. And many of the institutions represented here today are doing fantastic things. But there are some big structural questions that go far beyond the university sector, which we do need to address. And let's be blunt about them. One of them is, why do employers focus on some universities and not others? Why is it that we have a sector whereby degrees are not equal? And yet, why do we tell students that degrees are equal? We're engaged in false advertising, I think, because those who come from the middle class social environment understand instinctively the difference between university degrees, whereas those who do not have participation in the background take at face value the idea that a degree is a degree. Now, I believe a degree is a degree, and I believe that students get a fantastic deal at many universities who aren't the traditional ones that are seen by employers as perhaps the top ranked. All right, but I think that we need to tackle this head on, and I think we need to ask ourselves, what is there systemically that is proving to be still a block on the equal weighting of different degrees? So having said that as my kind of like base points on some of the issues I see in HE access, I want to throw out 3 things for us to think about as we move forward. One is that I think that the idea of consortia is absolutely the way we should be looking in the future. So that is both between HE and FE sectors, but also between HE institutions. Now, I'm in the Northeast, and one of the things that is very, very good for my students is that when they look at the local HE offer, there are some institutions which offer quite distinct things. The offer at Sunderland is different from the offer at Northumbria, and different from Newcastle, and different from Durham. But you know, where the differences exist, that is where the students are best served. They're not perhaps best served where the institutions are trying to offer the same course and suggest that the same outcomes are coming off that. And I actually think there's a lot of space here for suggesting that universities might cooperate and say, this is going to be our specialism, and this is going to be our specialism. We can work across, you know, the institutions, and we can perhaps think about what's best for the students rather than necessarily trying to kind of constantly compete. Now, the second idea I want to throw out is we work a lot with the opportunity areas. And, you know, as you may or may not know, these are areas that are identified through the Social Mobility Index as places where there is, you know, issues around social mobility and progression. There's a lot of work done by the DFE with the schools in those areas. But in my mind, a fantastic model for the future could be that universities engage with, not with the schools that wish to engage with them, but they engage with the schools that they are directed towards as the places which have the highest level of disadvantage and the greatest difficulties in actually progressing their students. And one could have a system whereby effectively the universities sponsored interventions directly for attainment, not simply to enroll students, but looking at attainment, 11 to 16 perhaps, in some of the most challenging schools in a given area. The last thing I'm going to throw out there is that I think data is a problem. As I indicated at the beginning, Polar, FSM, all of these tools are very, very blunt. But what is worse than the bluntness of the tools is the fact that the different stages of the sector use them in such different ways. Schools report on pupil premium and make their pupil premium catch-up plans up to the age of 16. Post-16 institutions then have no obligation to report on disadvantage at all, and that's not part of their funding. And then when students turn up for university, universities are measured on Polar. Well, I cannot see any justification for not having, first of all, a more fine-grained approach to the data. So, you know, again, perhaps looking at things like length of time on FSM, length of time on benefits of different kinds, and then also on taking that as a clear line of data and tracking all the way through from the school sector through the post-16 sector into the HE sector. The very last thing I'm going to touch on before I stop, because I know I have plenty of things we could go on, and I think discussion is going to be really important, is I was really, really pleased to hear the discussion of foundation years, because at the moment, in light of COVID, one of our recommendations is that we think foundation years could be a really valuable tool for students who have suffered significantly in COVID over the last year. So that would be the year 13 students who are coming up to their HE entrance in September. And we've actually recommended that the government fully fund foundation years for students who've been heavily impacted. So I just want to kind of sound that idea out with you guys. And if people think it is an appropriate idea, I would encourage you to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sammy. That was excellent, and really some interesting examples, some interesting analysis, but also some really important and valid challenge, I think, to the universities and our efforts in these, you know, really complicated and complex spaces. But huge thanks to you, Sammy, for that. I think what I might do is take some of your points and sort of throw them out as part of the broader questions now. And I might start maybe with Karen and Trevor as our resident vice chancellors in this call. particularly about the point around the offer of universities being often in competition with each other, and whether there was a way of working at a sort of regional level to try and, perhaps map to the skills needs and almost divvy up the curriculum pie, to use a fairly bad analogy, rather than potentially being in competition. And so sort of trying to look at the offer for the betterment of the local community, rather than perhaps through an institutional lens purely. Any thoughts on that, perhaps Karen, to start with?
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. I wholeheartedly agree with that. There are some great examples actually in the States of cities that have done that. Cities such as Detroit, who have come from real deprivation, and actually the universities, in that place, actually getting around the table with all of the other key stakeholders and saying, right, let's stop competing. What is it that we can do that is our, speciality? What is it that you can do to deliver for this place? And that ultimately has been the strategic direction that has guided, their portfolio and their course strategy. So I would wholeheartedly support that. And, we're very early stages, as I referenced, in terms of that skills ladder, but that is an opportunity for us to do that, not just between universities actually, but with FE as well.
Okay, I'm not sure I would agree with it. Partly to be controversial, in the sense that certainly, if you look at university with a broader brush, wanting to have a university that is broad-based in terms of research and everything else we do, recognizing that the main income driver, even in that situation, is around teaching. Then actually it would provide some really important holes that would actually have a knock-on effect. So I think, and I know it's not, the proposal isn't around going to very specialist institutions, because that would, that doesn't fit very well with sort of Darwinian type evolution, apart from anything else. But actually, I think we've got to be careful. Having said that, I think avoiding direct competition doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to segment things, and actually do accept that actually those sorts of conversations can identify flavors and nuances rather than significant chunks of activity.
Sammy, did you want to come back on that at all, or?
Yeah, I think. Look, I completely see the point on that. I think what I worry about is that it's very much from the student point of view, right? So the competition between universities is valid on the university's terms, but from the student point of view, they end up with these very difficult choices, such as a choice between a degree, a history degree at one institution, a history degree at another institution. And it is very unclear and very difficult to get the valid information as to how to make that choice. Because, as I said before about the kind of the notion of the stratification of degrees in our society, we have a lot of this background cultural information, and then we have the actual information coming from the universities. And a university obviously is going to sell what they're providing. So a lot of my students find it very, very difficult to negotiate that if they don't have the cultural background. And that's where the clarity of knowing that X institution is the institution for this kind of course and Y institution is the one for this kind of course, that is really, really helpful to young people.
Chris, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah. So really, really helpful prompt from Sammy, which really gets to the heart of the issue, which is, and we feel this very strongly as the regulator, because in a way we have duties around choice. And part of the answer to what Sammy's saying is actually the legislative settlement currently is about choice and providing students with choice, but regulated choice. So the question then is, how do we regulate to make it, to help it be an informed choice that everybody can make well? And also, and that's obviously the origin of a lot of the fair access outreach work, but also what's the balance with collaboration? And in the current legislative system we have, we're not Wisconsin or California. So I could make a great argument for for why that would be good. And indeed, you know, there have been times when people have said the Northeast ought to be a pilot for this, because it'd be a great example of where it could work. You know, different missions of universities, 2+2 that was talked about in the comments, you know, progression. But that's not how our system works currently. I think the interesting question for us is, how do we balance competition and choice and collaboration? And the whole purpose of the investment in UniConnect is to get people to work together to avoid cross wires in engaging with schools, to maximize efficiency, to make it sustained rather than one-off, to professionalize it, etc. And there may be other areas where we need to do that as well. So Omar's work, an example of collaboration and sharing evaluation findings. A lot of research investment is collaborative. So the question for me is, how do we balance this? What do we do on the collaborative side to provide the incentives for it to happen more? Karen mentions institutes of technology, for example.
Thanks, Chris. That's really useful. I mean, a couple of questions from the comments, but also sort of, you know, there was some discussion about the broader sort of policy landscape. And we've talked quite a bit today about collaboration, particularly between universities and FE, and talking with Sami now about schools, etc. I mean, is the kind of narrative from the government, do you think, helpful in this space? Given a lot of it does feel a little bit antagonistic towards the relationship between FE and HE, and almost sort of pitting one off against each other. And I guess the challenge to us is how do we overcome that? And I guess we'd be interested in reflections from the speakers on how best to sort of make the case that we're not necessarily enemies, but, you know, that we would be stronger and better by working together. So, you know, whilst we might be talking about collaboration and exchange, there does feel like there's a bit of a sense out there that the competition is stronger, and that, you know, we're almost being kind of pitted against each other, and how can we overcome that? I'm not sure that that's a very helpful dynamic. So I guess there's a broad sort of, my question there is sort of a broad one about perceptions of the two sectors. And then also with the recent avalanche, you know, there was comments in the chat from the Association of Colleges about, you know, what sorts of opportunities might there be? What other things could we do more effectively together than we already are? So I open that to any of the speakers, but perhaps Chris, starting with you as our OFS man in the chair.
Okay, so I'll say two things. So one is good examples. So, you know, what Karen was talking about the skills ladder, organizations in local areas working together and demonstrating how they're doing that for the benefit of the place. That will be very powerful, and showing how FE and HE come together on that. That's important. Bad examples are very negative, and we do hear bad examples of how those relationships work. I think the other thing to flag is we need to keep articulating how skills extends across all the levels. So there was a conversation about AI training at postgraduate level, for example. So skills is about all levels of education. It's not just about FE, and I think we need to see it in those terms and enable students to progress throughout the levels.
Great. Any of the other speakers want to jump in there before I go to another question?
Can I just say something quickly on that, which is just that,
yep.
I think one of the issues is that it's a lot easier to collaborate from a position of strength. And I think that one thing, you know, I'll actually use an example from schools on this. When I moved to Sunderland to work in the schools there, I'd moved from London, and in London, all the roles were full. So schools were able to collaborate because they were not in competition for students. And I went to Sunderland, and because the population was falling, the roles were falling, and schools were at each other's throats. So I think there is something here about funding for universities and the kind of cutthroat environment that has been created, particularly amongst the lower tariff universities, where they end up competing very fiercely for students. And then again, actually maybe around the requirements around average UCAS entry. You know, I know anecdotally of some institutions who are very, very keen to make sure their average UCAS offer is constantly going up, and that creates an environment where the competition is unhealthy. So I think there's something about the framing of the environment and the framing of the funding that can have a big impact here.
Thanks, Sami.
Could I, Natalie, just very briefly?
Yeah, please do, Trevor. Yep.
I think one of the tensions is, I think it might have been Omar that I think mentioned it, and sort of thinking about effectively the footprint we're talking about. When we're talking about increasing local prosperity, what do we mean by local? And that then feeds into, who are we competing with? And defining the geographies is really quite fascinating, because a lot of what we do tends to be determined by political boundaries, because it'll be a city or a town or a county or a LEP area. But actually, I'm sitting here on the Keele campus. I can be within 3 different counties within 6 miles of here. We're literally just at one of those points in between, and yet we tend to point in one direction. And everything the Higher Horizons has extended that into 2 of the counties, and that's very helpful. But even thinking about who we should collaborate between universities on individual things, we know that if we look at our comparators or our competitors in different things, they can be very different for our different types of activities. And likewise, our collaborations. We do a lot with Staffordshire University. That's our nearest university. But likewise, we've just set up a joint vet school as a completely two-university initiative with Harper Adams, which is that bit further away. And we work with those more broadly in the Midlands. So I suppose what I'm saying is the whole idea of collaboration is absolutely critical and important, but pinning it down to how and where and when we do that and who with is a much more complex thing where there's a lot of tension to work through.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's been a bit of comment in the chat about university outreach and whether it's would be appropriate for it to sort of not just target the sort of post-18s, but sort of be a bit more embedded in the sort of whole student journey and perhaps engage with sort of younger people more actively. I wonder if any of our speakers had any sort of thoughts on whether they're doing things in that space or whether more could be done, or if the system is a bit too skewed to the sort of other end, or the sort of decision end of a education platform.
I will say quickly that is a project that I've been involved in. I've been working with Oxford and Durham on an outreach project in the Northeast for a while, and we've managed to persuade them to work with Year 4 onwards. So from my school, we used, well, before COVID, we were doing this, but we were using the school as a hub to go out into the primary feeder schools and do outreach from Year 4 onwards, and with a series of different outreaches at each stage. So there was an outreach for the Year 4 and 5, for 7 and 8, for 10 and 11, and for 12 and 13, each tackling a different part of it. I think it's a great model. It's really difficult to persuade anyone to buy into it though, because you're talking about returns coming in 10 years' time.
Definitely a long-term strategy, Sammy, but it sounds worthwhile doing. I mean, perhaps that's something that you can share with us through the Civic University Network, and we can sort of help to promote that with our connections and colleagues here. Karen, did you want to pitch in there?
Yeah, just on that, I think there are some fantastic examples out there, though, of universities that are engaging and making interventions really at all levels, right through from primary up. I know from my time in Scotland, Glasgow Caledonian, they've got a fantastic project that has been going now for over 10 years. So they've got longitudinal evidence and research to back up what the impact of those interventions. And I think, I think there is already a lot of great work being done. I think the issue is, making sure that you can fund that so that it can produce the long-term impact and the long-term raise aspirations over the length of that student journey.
I just wanted to come in on two things.
Please do, Omar. Yep.
Yeah, that we're looking at. So first, it's not primary, but we're doing a randomized control trial with summer schools. So summer schools are obviously an intervention that almost many universities are doing. And I think there is a bit of a question mark of, we know that they're effective in raising aspirations and attainment. But there is a concern about selection bias, i.e. that the kids who go or are selected for summer schools already had an aptitude. We're already likely amongst those to attend. So we're doing a randomized control trial to determine what about the summer schools, which summer schools are having the most effect. So we'll have some results from that from next year. But I think that is a wider challenge, especially with the having kind of I think there is a lot of activity happening with schools and universities, but it is a little bit dependent on a particular head teacher or a particular head of year being interested in it. And so the question is, that's good activity, but how do we ensure that we're really reaching the most disadvantaged kids in that stuff and in those sorts of interventions? And is there a way to scale it up, so that it's not just reliant on an individual head teacher, head of year, or whatever, who themselves might have had a similar life journey or went to university and it really changed their life. I did want to just quickly come back on the FE colleges, because I was on the board of the University of East London for a few years. And obviously, we had a lot of our students actually came via FE colleges. So I think it's important not to forget that FE colleges both provide some HE provision. There's HE provision in FE colleges, but also that there is a route existing now. For some institutions, it's extremely important, in fact, the link between the local college and the local university. And that there are examples there, but I do take the point, I forget who made it, but that there's also competition. So obviously, typically there'll be a college is linked with one particular institution. So yeah, sorry, the final point I want to make too is on belonging. Sorry, I think one of the things that's emerging quite interesting, although the data aren't great, is just how important belonging is to people wanting to stay locally, but also to stay in their institution. And on the one hand, I think FE colleges often are a route for people who feel like the institution up the road that's big and shiny and university-ish is not an appropriate or open place for them. So they feel that the local connection is stronger. But I think the flip side that we have to be cautious about at some of this discussion is I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for an 18-year-old to want to go to a different city or town for their university experience or their college experience, and then go somewhere else for their job. And in fact, that's good for social mixing. So I think there are concerns about kind of too strong a driver policy-wise of trying to retain people locally all the time. And actually, institutions welcome having a little bit of diversity regionally within their student populations as well. So yeah, a lot of big questions. I don't have answers to that, but I think it's important not to forget that there's nothing wrong with a student deciding, I want to go to Manchester just for the years of 18 to 21, or I want to actually get out of Manchester and go somewhere, closer to the countryside. It's nothing, we shouldn't tell students not to do that also in terms of choice.
Very true. I guess there's kind of a few questions in the chat just before we finish up, just related to sort of data and metrics. And I know Sammy kind of put a bit of a challenge on data, which I thought was a very, powerful one. But there's, we've got Hannah in the chat there talking about the metrics we use around sort of engaging with local areas. And so, certainly that's something we're thinking about in the Civic University Network around a sort of civic index idea. And I guess I just wanted to call on the panelists about whether they think we have got the metrics right in terms of how you evidence this sort of impact on sort of the local economy, on and sort of questions about local prosperity, about knowledge exchange and civic engagement. And I guess I put that question to you, Omar, but also to Chris and others. And also if colleagues had any reflections on Sammy's direct challenge about the data we are using, which does, as you did make the point, gets used in so many different ways in different audiences, and what we might do to overcome that. Chris, do you want to start off?
Yeah, so again, really welcome the challenge on data. I mean, let me start with low participation neighborhoods. So these are, I think there's only the average of about 80 people. They're small areas where persistently, I mean, this hasn't shifted much at all, levels of higher education has been very low. So of course, for an individual, I wouldn't ever advocate you just choose a student, make a decision about a student on the basis of that area-based data. But it's relevant. We haven't succeeded in bringing those communities into higher education over a long period of time. I do think we need to get more sophisticated with it. So part of what we were publishing a couple of weeks ago was looking at how you align place with other indicators like free school meal status and ethnicity, and we want to deploy that more. And I would always say to a university, but you need to make a decision about that individual in your admissions process rather than just looking at this data. The other thing I was going to pick up on data, which I think runs through quite a few of the comments, is about league tables. So I've spent a lot of time unsuccessfully trying to shift the measures used in league tables. Tariff points, for example. The Times does a great social mobility table but everybody really looks at the main table. So, if you can all get behind me and get a more sensible league table approach, I think that would have quite an effect.
We can never get through a HE discussion without league tables coming up at some point, I think. Omar, did you want to come in on metrics and data?
Yeah, I do think it is a challenge that our metrics are not always good enough, but I would speak up that, they are crude, but as Chris says, they're quite strong in some cases. The correlations are persistent over time, over place. And so, I think Tundra, those metrics are good. I would like to see, more individualized data where you can, and especially if we start considering other kinds of interventions. For example, something like more widespread use of contextualized admissions. Well, to do that effectively, the contextualization has to be accurate. And so the more we consider other kinds of policy interventions that might shift the dial even more on social mobility, the more we need even better data, I would say. And I think just taking one piece of data, looking at the income data, I think Sammy did talk about this. So London has the highest income levels of any region if you rank the sort of 10 English regions. But once you control for housing costs, it drops to 5th. So, it shows the importance of those sorts of contexts and thinking about things like free school meals as well. So we have both the problem of it not being individualized enough, but also in terms of making sure you have, the appropriate benchmarks and context. And I think in that case, it is, you do need as many different kinds of data as you can. And it is one of the things we're going to be trying to do at TASO, is improving the consistency and quality of data along with OFS.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Sorry, were you looking to come in there, Sammy?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, I think I absolutely take the point that there's value in all these different data sets. I think what I'm really looking for more than anything else is, first of all, the nuance, but also the through line. So maybe the answer is that schools should look at polar. The point is that we're measuring different things and we're calling them by the same name. And if we want to have a proper coherent approach to this, we need to measure the same things and actually track these students through, because otherwise we've got no idea what's actually working with a given student or a given category.
Brilliant. I feel like we could do with an extra half an hour or more, or perhaps, even longer for this discussion. There's been huge amounts of interesting challenge and discussion, I think, this afternoon. And unfortunately, we are having to sort of draw to a close. So apologies to all in the chat that have posed questions that we've not been able to get to. There is, of course, the Civic University Network members area, where there will be a forum there where colleagues can continue the conversation in the chat and sort of share that information. So please do log on there and continue the chat. I guess it's now my job to just really thank all the speakers for what I think has been a fantastic afternoon's discussion, really wide-ranging and lots of fantastic examples, but also, as we said, challenge and discussion and some quite deep issues out there around data and metrics and so on that we need to grapple with. So firstly, as chair, I just want to huge thanks to Chris and Karen, Omar, Trevor, and Sammy for a fantastic afternoon, and for all the people online with their chats and questions and so on. So huge thanks from me and the Civic University Network for your time. It's now that point of the day where I talk about future things coming up. So we've got a couple of events to pencil in the diary, a workshop on the 23rd of February around the Civic University Agreement and community engagement, how effectively to do that. And then also another webinar on the 5th of March on the sort of civic. So please do sign up. And we've also, I think, got save the dates out for our big Civic University conference, which will be happening in May. So something there to look out for. But thank you again. Please do continue the discussion in the members area, and we'll hope to see you again at another one of our events very soon. But thanks very much.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you.
Yes.
Just say thanks, Natalie.
Thank you. It's great to have you.
Great chairing. Well done. Thanks, Karen, as well.
Yes, thanks, Natalie. Thanks, Chris. It was great. There was so much there, wasn't there? There was definitely needed more time, didn't we? To get into
It's always the way. No, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
You too. Thanks again. Thanks, Karen.